Hello, my name is James Parson, and I will be doing my speech on capital punishment. And this is my audience: Frank, Lynn, and Sarah. A conservative estimate says that for every 1,000 murders, there's approximately 1,800 victims affected. And the question is, why does everyone hear so much about the killers and so little about the families left behind to pick up the pieces? In 1985, 13-year-old Karen Parson was shot to death in her bed in North Charleston, South Carolina. Her killer was a neighbor who had already served 10 years of a life sentence for murdering his brother Charles in 1970. Joe Atkins cut the Pattersons' phone lines and entered the house bearing a machete, a sawed-off shotgun, and a pistol. He chased out Karen's parents out of their home and then proceeded up to her bedroom to shoot her. It was later found out that after killing Karen, he then went back to his home and murdered his stepfather, Charles, who was 75, and who was actually the one who helped persuade the parole authorities to release Joe from his life sentence. So what happens when murderers get a second chance? They get a second chance to kill. In the year 1993 alone, over 18,000 people were arrested for murder in the United States. Today, there are over 2,500 murderers on death row, and there will be less than 50 executions this year. That means for every 15,000 to 20,000 murderers per year, that's less than 50 executions, according to the Commission's report on capital sentencing. The death penalty, the fact is, the death penalty needs to start being used in more states and in more prisons nationwide. When the country consensus had reached 1,000 murders, 1,000 executions, it was made into a big deal throughout the country. And the attention given to these executions, to these murderers, is repulsive, especially when the loudest voices think that the death penalty on a convicted murderer is a tragedy. Yet the deaths and sufferings of countless victims is only an easily ignored statistic. The death penalty is clearly not used enough. The simple fact remains that there are way too murders a year, and they need to be taken care of. The murder rate can be lowered if the death penalty is used in the proper way and is a real threat to these criminals. Many say that the death penalty will not make a difference, and to point at the states who have had the death penalty and abolished it. For that, the reasoning would be that they did not use the death penalty as many times as needed. They only used it a few times, and it did not really show an effect toward the murderers. For these criminals to sit, too many criminals sit on death row for years, wasting away, waiting to die. What kind of life is that? Why not put these inmates out of their misery and save taxpayers money? Life without parole faces, on average, 30 to 40 years in prison, while an annual cost of $40,000 to $50,000 a year for each prisoner. There's no question that the upfront cost of the death penalty is significantly higher than the equivalent in life without parole cases. But there also appears to be no question that, over time, the equivalent of life without parole cases are much more expensive, ranging from 1.2 to 3.6 million, rather than the death penalty cases, according to the Commission on the Fair Administration of Justice. If a person is to be found guilty and sentenced to death, then why are taxpayers paying to keep them alive? It just doesn't make sense. The federal government and the individual states need to use the death penalty more often and more efficiently. Among 50 states, the death penalty is abolished in 15 of them, and 5 haven't carried out any recent executions. The government and local political leaders need to increase those numbers within those states. More states need to use capital punishment as a valid punishment toward the criminal offenders in their states. Although many people in the United States are pro-capital punishment, there's been a minuscule amount of people who have actually been executed in the United States for committing murder. And the country as a whole needs to step up those numbers and executions in every city and state. Prisons nationwide are overcrowded and are getting worse as time goes on. According to the prison release report last week shows an increase of federal inmates last year. According to the prison release last week that shows records of increase of federal inmates last year. The Bureau of Justice Statistics, which releases findings about prisoners' populations about twice a year, records a 7.2 growth in federal prisons in the first half of 2001, and a 1.6 growth population in statewide prisons. When prisoners are sentenced to life without parole, they just sit in the prisons and take up much space which is needed. And even once they are locked up, they commit even more crimes while being locked up. That does not stop them from being who they are. And it leads to other inmates getting hurt and even prison guards. And now that prisons are starting to become overcrowded, it leads to more problems and even worse, breakouts and riots in these facilities. It could lead to massive problems across the U.S. and could start to possibly hurt the general public.